Alright, welcome back to another video, David's collection of VHS, DVDs, games, and more. Today I am going to be doing my Nickelodeon video cassette and DVD collection. Now I have 39 DVDs and 6 video cassettes. It's going to be freaking epic. Now let's get on to the video. So starting here, I have 2 Rugrats movies DVDs. They both work, but only one of them is cracked, but it still works. Next up is Rugrats in Paris the movie. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up, I have 2 Rugrats Go Wild. They both work, but only one of them has some issues. Next up, I have Blue's Big Band right here. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up, I have 3 Blue's Clues shapes and colors. They all work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up, I have 3 Blue's Clues Blue Takes You to Schools. They all work perfectly fine, but only one of them make a loud sound. Next up is Oswald and Welcome to Big City. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Dora the Explorer and Meet Diego. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Nicktoons Halloween. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. It's my first DVD to feature Rocket Power and Hey Arnold. Even though Hey Arnold is a really old show. Next up is Blue's Clues and Classic Clues. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Room and Snack Time Playdate. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue Stock. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is SpongeBob SquarePants, Sponge for Hire, my first ever SpongeBob SquarePants DVD. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the Nick Jr. Celebrate Spring DVD. It's my first DVD with Max and Ruby and Little Bill. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Room and It's Hug Day. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is SpongeBob SquarePants and Absorbing Favorites. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up, I have 3 Blue's Room alphabet powers. They all work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Barnyard. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue's Biggest Stories. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Little Bear and Halloween Stories. It works, but the trailers messes up. Next up is Dick Pics Holiday. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is SpongeBob SquarePants and To Love a Patty. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Go Diego Go and Diego's Magical Missions. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Go Diego Go and the Great Dinosaur Rescue Special Edition. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Yo Gabba Gabba New Friends, my first ever Yo Gabba Gabba DVD. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Yo Gabba Gabba and Let's Visit the Doctor. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever, even though in the back there's a goof with the Paramount logo being a 95 logo. Next up is Dora the Explorer and Dora's Butterfly Ball. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the SpongeBob movie, Sponge Out of Water. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever, even though the case is in really bad condition. Otherwise it works. Next up is SpongeBob SquarePants and the Adventures of SpongeBob SquarePants. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Now, on to the next row. Next up is Good Burger. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the SpongeBob SquarePants Complete First Season with 3 discs inside. Did a video on this. They all work perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the SpongeBob SquarePants Complete Second Season Box Set. Last of the DVDs. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. They work perfectly fine. Even though my favorite episode is Sailor Mouth because it features swear words that are funny. Now on to VHSs. Starting with VHSs, this is Rugrats and the Santa Experience. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever, and the tape is in very good condition with a minor scratch right here. Next up is Rugrats and a Rugrats Vacation. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever, and it's in very good condition with minor scratches. Next up is Blue's Clues and Story Time. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. It's in very good condition with 2 crack marks, as you can see right here. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue's Big Treasure Hunt. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Rugrats in Paris the movie. I have it on DVD, also on video cassette. It works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. It's in very good condition with minor scratches. Last but not least is Blue's Clues and Blue's Safari. Works perfectly fine with no issues whatsoever. Is in mint condition with no scratches. That's going to do with me with my Nickelodeon video cassette and DVD collection. This is Davian's collection of VHS, DVDs, games, and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment. And I'll see you again in my next video.